I am pleased to introduce our last but certainly not least speaker of the day, Deanna Fassett. Do you pronounce your name Fassett or
Fassett?
Fassett, okay. Fassett, like a diamond.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
All right.
Spelled differently.
Spelled differently. She is the director of the Center for Faculty Development, and she is a co-sponsor of this event. And so she's going to do, as we might say, bat cleanup here and talk about inclusive instruction. So,
Thank you.
Deanna.
So I am going to move around a little bit, and partly that's so I can honor the fact that you are the last few standing here, or sitting, as the case may be, and so that you feel like you get some value out of this last session and that you don't feel like you're getting more talked at than I think maybe you already feel. One of the things I wanted to do was show you the closed captioning or the live captioning whenever you use Google Slides. And for whatever reason, this isn't letting me access the microphone on there. But when you get into presentation mode, it's very easy to pop on the captions. And so it works pretty well, except for really technical kinds of terminology. But otherwise, it scrolls behind you, and everyone can see it. And as long as you don't get distracted by it as a teacher, you're in pretty good shape. So you can see I had kind of a catch bucket for the title of my session. I had inclusive instruction, best practices for engaging students through lesson planning, grading, and more. And that's a lot of stuff, and I don't know that we'll do all of it, but my hope is to orient you a little bit. This is what an orientation does. It's a little bit like pin the tail on the donkey. You put the blindfold on someone, you spin them around a lot, but you don't let them just take the pin in whatever direction. You point them toward the donkey, right? And in this case, I hope you feel a little better than that, but that's kind of how that's going. At least you know where to ask the right questions. I thought it might help to give you a little sense of my background. As Dean DeLarco mentioned, I am the new director for the Center for Faculty Development at San Jose State, but prior to that, I was a department chair and a faculty member in the Department of Communication Studies. And these two roles are relevant to you in a couple ways. One is that with my role as director for the Center for Faculty Development, I would like for you to understand that the Center for Faculty Development is also for you. That you may participate in workshops there, that you may suggest content that happens there, and that this is not something that a tenure-track faculty member only accesses or that only an instructor of record would use, although I know some of you are likely instructors of record. Okay. We run workshops, we have consultations, we're able to help you with university websites. We've got a bunch of things that we run out of that shop, and I'm very happy to have you reach out to me or to any member of the staff. In my role as a professor in communication studies, I was also the graduate teaching associate supervisor there. I did that for 18 years, and in that role I worked with between 10 and 15 brand new instructors, no instructional experience, who became instructors of record for lower division communication studies courses. So public speaking, critical thinking, argumentation, and so on. So as you can tell, I know a little bit about what it's like to be a brand new TA, and I was certainly a TA once, many, many moons ago. And I was a TA for 4 years whenever I was working on my master's and my PhD. And when I did that, I was about 22. And I remember some of the concerns that I had about feeling like I had authority in that space, feeling like I demonstrated competence and credibility in that space. And in some ways that informs my talk with you today. I'm going to raise what I think are helpful concerns and considerations for you. But if at the end of that you think, gosh, you know what I really wish she'd talked about was some other thing, tell me what that thing is. You can either come by and chat with me about it, or I'm happy to take emails. I'm happy and definitely eager to have that inform what I do next. So you can always reach out to me like just about anyone else at San Jose State. It's first name dot last name at sjsu.edu. Just remember that in my case, there's a couple N's, a couple S's, and a couple T's. And if you forget one of them, it goes out into the void, and who knows exactly where it goes. So part of where I wanted to lead with is what is my area of expertise, which is instructional communication. And I built a career and a publication history as a researcher and an educator around communication in the classroom and communication really in any teaching and learning situation. So I'm interested in taking up today the role of instructional communication in meaningful and successful learning settings, whether that's a laboratory, a one-on-one session, your office hours, you name it, right? A large lecture hall. So before we go too far, though, I'd like you to do something in your, just kind of quietly to yourselves. Can you get in your mind like the best teacher you ever had? The best one. Okay. Can you think a little more carefully, like what made that person so good at their job? Right? You got somebody in mind? Can I have somebody who's willing to describe that person for me? Very briefly.
For me, it was a high school Spanish teacher.
Uh-huh.
He was extremely knowledgeable in the field and grammar and different Spanish countries and cultures, but a lot of his class had to do with just having fun, and I feel like we all learned as much about life as we did about Spanish in that class.
Very good. Okay, so this was someone who had a lot of credibility. You could trust that they knew what they were talking about, and they weren't afraid to have a kind of light way of getting into it, of enjoying it, that learning doesn't have to be this drudgerous slog, that it could be delightful. Anyways, okay, let's have one more person. Really, here's one right here.
Dr. Mohsen Janapur. He's a physics professor at College of San Mateo. What I really liked about him, what made me interested more into actually becoming a physics major, was how engaging and interactive he was. It wasn't just him talking and lecturing up there. He was individually looking us in the eyes and talking about it, telling stories, telling jokes, and keeping it nice and lighthearted, even though physics is very hard. But he made it enjoyable to come to class every day and to learn. It was the first time in my life I was okay with waking up at 6 in the morning to go to class.
Wow, that's high praise.
Yeah.
That's high praise. Very good. All right. So now take a moment and think about like the worst instructor you had. We're not going to ask you to name names, okay? But literally some of the less effective ones for you. Do you have somebody or a couple somebodies in mind? I mean, maybe you've been blessed with really fantastic instructors, and I hope that's true, but what was that person like, or what was that experience like? You have someone who's willing to share? Just generally, again, you're not gonna out that particular instructor.
Thanks. I just had a professor that was always late to class and just would show up late, and he would always have his back to the students, and it just seemed like the class would take forever and just no interaction between the students.
All right, so like time stops while you're staring at this guy's back.
Yeah, it wasn't the most interesting subject anyway. But
So that didn't help.
that didn't help. No.
All right. Anybody want to add to that? That's probably good. I mean, we're focused on the positives today and not the negatives. We're not aspiring to be bad instructors today. We're aspiring to be the best sorts of instructors, right? And what role does communication play in that? So that's part of what I want to talk to you about today. Before we do, though, I think it's worth setting your intentions as an instructor in whatever role that looks like for you in your particular discipline, department, and course. I'm going to use Joan Wink's 3 categories here as a way of thinking about that. There's lots of other ways we could do this, of course, but one way is to think about what your purpose is in your engagement with students. Is your goal, for example, to transmit information? And I'm not going to ask you to vote which way you want to go here, but I would suggest humbly that if transmission were easy, you could simply ask students to read the book, and they would know what was in it, and we'd be good to go, right? I think there's more to it than transmission. And transmission implies that you're a pure source of information and that you can just simply deposit those contents into somebody else's head. And again, humans are so much more complicated than that. So I'd like to offer two other possibilities based on Joan Wink's book. One of those is being generative. That is a way of thinking about teaching and learning where you are all engaged in a degree of problem solving, okay? Where you have the subject of your investigation at the center of the room, of your conversations, of your work together, and you're all interested in and invested in better understanding whatever that problem or subject matter or area of focus is. In public speaking, this can look like what constitutes good speaking. How do we do that? How does that vary from one culture to another? How does that vary from one setting to another? How do different audiences determine what is or is not credible? And so putting a question or an area of focus in the center of your action together can make the subject feel more real, more vivid, more valuable for all of the folks in the room. And that doesn't mean that you don't have expertise. You're just not pretending to be the font of wisdom in that case, right? Which is kind of a difficult burden to bear, particularly when you're a relatively new instructor. The last one is just something for your consideration. Do you hope that the work in your class with your students will be transformative? Is it, if we think of generation as engendering new ideas, creating new ideas, new applications, new experiences, then transformation takes us in a little different direction. It asks us to consider who is transformed. What is transformed? In what ways? Is the purpose of this instructional experience to change the people in the room, to help them grow, to have an effect on the campus, in the community, in the world, right? And it's worth taking a little time yourself thinking about what is your purpose as an instructor? Why would you teach? What does teaching entail? It's not simply transmitting content. It's not only transmitting content. So, these are a little bit textually dense. You're going to have access to these slides, I believe, through a shared Canvas space. So you can always come back and kind of sit with them and think about them a little bit. But in general, we know from, probably the most famous example of teacher expectations would be Pygmalion in the classroom. But in this case, we know that teachers have expectations. It's worth noting what yours are at the outset. What are you already assuming about your students? And how are you directly and indirectly communicating those expectations to your students? We know, for example, teachers have these expectations and they're going to influence how you behave in the classroom. Students will pick up on those messages, however subtle or direct, and they will act accordingly. And we know that if you as a teacher are consistent in your messages and in your behaviors, and if you communicate high expectations of your students, students will respond. But if you offer them only low expectations, if you assume they're not doing the reading, for example, then they will not rise to those expectations. They'll dial it back accordingly. We also know that students' self-concept will affect their learning. And we know that that has a lot to do with, in some ways, self-fulfilling prophecies. And I'm sure we can all think of exceptions to this where maybe you've heard the message that you're not good at math, and then there's a person who says, I'll show you, and they turn out to be really excellent at math. But those folks tend to be the exception rather than the rule. In general, we allow our self-concepts to shape our learning, and we do that in large measure because of how we feel about what we're learning. So how do we create a space where students feel excited to be there, where they have a sense of excitement and desire to be in the space? And I think if we go back and we think about your worst teachers and your best teachers, we would find elements of defensive classroom climates with your worst teachers and supportive classroom climates with your best teachers. In the worst iteration of this, a defensive classroom is characterized by punishment and really kind of abuse of power and control, and the kinds of things that I don't think TAs are inclined typically to do because they don't really feel super empowered at first usually. But I think of the instructor walking in late, turning their back to the class. I mean, that's a space where it seems to me like the instructor's not seeking engagement with students, not really interested in building a relationship with the students. And I think that in some ways leans more toward a defensive classroom space where that instructor's setting up their own defenses. Okay? But a supportive classroom environment is characterized by a kind of flexibility. You've got a sense of trust, a willingness to experiment. Probably not a lot of confrontation, although it's not conflict averse, right? But the conflicts are very different in a supportive classroom environment. They're more about really struggling to make better sense of something, or really working to create a climate where people can learn with and from each other. Okay, so the space is a little bit different. And the communication of the instructor leads us more to one than the other. New teachers are often worried about whether or not they'll be perceived as credible. I won't speak for you. I mean, I don't know if you've had this thought like, oh, somebody's going to come tap me on the shoulder and say, maybe this is not for you. But it really is, right? You're not here accidentally. You're here as a result of a number of careful screening processes that result in your departments and programs making sure that they've chosen wisely and someone who will represent that discipline and that department well. One way of thinking about credibility is to parse it along three categories: competence, character, and caring. Okay? And in some ways, we could also think about charisma as a part of this too, whether you're charming and whether or not people find you engaging, although I think that one is more culturally mediated and can be a little bit trickier to figure out. Basically, where students perceive an instructor to be credible, they'll be more motivated to learn. They'll have a more positive experience learning. They will therefore learn better, and they'll have an increase in out-of-office communication, or out-of-class communication, rather. They'll come to your office or they'll catch up with you in the hallways because they trust you, because they feel like you have knowledge or experience or insight into processes that are worth sharing. And there are some best practices for that, right? You can have a very structured length of time with them, whether that's in a one-on-one session or if that's in a particular lesson or lab experiment. The structure would be something that's predictable, that's clear, and for which they see relevance, both in and beyond the classroom, right? Because I think it's all too tempting to say, well, you're going to need this for the test, or you're going to need this for the paper. But you can't leave it at that. It has to go beyond that. It has to be, what are the applications beyond this particular assignment or this particular course? So that's what I mean by transitions that provide logical and psychological orientation. Logical would be, here's what to expect. First, we're going to do this, then we'll do this, then we'll do that, and finally we'll do this other thing. So we have a sense of what's happening when, just like a preview in a paper or a speech, right? But a psychological orientation or psychological closure, if we think toward the end of a lesson, that's where you come back and you talk about why it matters, why it should matter to the student. It sounds like in the case of the Spanish teacher, that person knew a lot about the culture, certainly knew the grammar, certainly knew his stuff, right? And so examples that highlight that, even if you're relatively new to a discipline, even if you're not done with that master's degree yet, you still have at least one degree of separation from the students in the room. You have expertise, even if you're not an expert per se. And that means you can cite examples and you can call to bear research that helps support your perspective. And certainly we tend to see people we trust as more credible because they've gone to lengths to establish a relationship. And that doesn't mean you need to know every little detail about your students' lives, but that you endeavor to care about what's going on in their lives and you adapt the course content or the learning in relation to it. One thing we know is that credible instructors are immediate instructors, and immediacy is about closing the distance. How do you close the distance between you and your students? And some of those behaviors are verbal, some of them are nonverbal. What's the difference between verbal and nonverbal? Yeah, but what's the difference?
Nonverbal can be body language, hand motion. Nonverbal is direct and using your voice to project your feelings.
Close. We're getting there. Anybody want to add to that? Verbal would be with our words. That's what verbal means. It's not necessarily oral. Verbal is with words, nonverbal is without words. So yeah, kind of on that same page, right? So something, a verbal immediacy behavior where we're using our words, be knowing students' names and using them, right? So, hey, Alex, how's it going? You know, or what did you do over the weekend? Oh, okay. I mean, be careful with what you do over the weekend. You don't ask a question you don't actually want the answer to. But, yeah, within reason, you know, hey, did you catch the Giants game? That's a little less fraught, right? Nonverbal immediacy behaviors. What would be something we could do nonverbally to close distance with our students and create connection? Yeah, Alex? Eye contact, yeah, very good. That's right. So getting up here and tying off. Or the other thing I see a lot of relatively new instructors do, they get tethered to a computer or they get kind of caught behind a podium. And sometimes you'll even see them kind of rock on the podium or grip it or what. It's like, no, just get away from that. You can have notes. It's okay to have notes, but you don't need to be tied to your notes. You don't need to be tied to your laptop. Did you have something you wanted to say? No? Smiling. Yeah, right. I mean, as it's appropriate, right? We don't want to smile when the topic is really serious, but as it's appropriate to smile, that seems like a reasonable thing to do. Okay. The other thing that's important to know is that there's some research to suggest that the students who will do best in a traditionally configured classroom will be the ones right here along the aisle and the ones right in the front row. What do you suppose that would be? Yes, ma'am. Right, so when a teacher's scanning the classroom, that's where their eyes are going, right? And you feel maybe a little bit more on the hot seat if I'm up in your space, right? It's a little bit harder for me to get back into the corners, not impossible. But in a sense, your students will fare better if you can figure out how to give every student in the room a front row seat. What does that look like? And how do you do it so it's not creepy? It's going to take a little bit of practice, right? But some of it is about creating this climate of anticipatory tension, right? They don't know exactly what's going to happen next because you might actually be up there and, you know, you're not surveilling, you're not looking at what they're doing necessarily, but you're making sure that you're engaged and you're making eye contact and you're moving through the space and you close the distance to them, making it easier for them to form an appropriate relationship with you. Right? We heard about inappropriate relationships earlier, right? We're talking about appropriate ones. And they can then trust you, and you can make eye contact, and you can get a better sense of how are they doing? Are they well or unwell? Are they understanding or not? And those things can be really helpful to you. We can, whenever we get a chance for you to ask questions, it's possible that you might have questions around humor or that kind of thing, and we can certainly talk about that. Sarcasm is very tricky. Very, very few instructors can actually get away with sarcasm. I think in my entire career I've met one. Sarcasm is really tricky because it can make people feel bad, and often does make them feel bad, right? Well, of course, you all did the reading, right? Well, okay, I'm not going to do it anymore, you know? And so the more you can focus on positive, pro-social, uplifting kinds of messages, the more likely they are to learn. And the other thing, I was thinking about online communication as well. What does immediacy look like in an online mode when you're in Canvas or when you're on email? And it seems to me like it's, it's tempting to use little, emoticons or things like that. And I do that a little bit, I have a little smiley faces. And then I read things about how women really probably shouldn't do that quite so much because it softens the message. And there's a lot of there that we could unpack. But in general, a practice I felt really comfortable recommending was trying to respond in a timely way, whether that's in Canvas or via email. And by that, I don't mean being a jack-in-the-box or a bot that responds immediately to everything. You are not at your students' beck and call. Part of your job is to model appropriate behavior, which means you are not available 24/7 all of the time. Right? And you don't want to teach them that that's what it takes to be successful in your field or in education. But what you can do is you can clearly communicate to them when you're going to return messages, when you're going to attend to online communication, and you can set a reasonable standard, 48 hours, let's say, for when you'll reply to a message. And that helps students learn permeable boundaries as well. It's good practice for you in your dual role as being both a student and a teacher. Clarity is also really important. It's something that I think people can struggle with. You have to know your students well enough, and they have to trust you enough to let you know when you're not being clear. Still, there are things you can do to be more clear. And if you think about your own best instructors, you've seen good behavior and clarity, right? You've seen people who signpost, who provide examples and illustrations, who work through or walk through a process step by step. And it's important to use a variety of teaching methods, right? You can use discussions, you can use small group work, you can think more in terms of problem-based learning, you can think about lectures. If you lecture, when does it happen? Where does it happen? How long should it happen? Those are all important things to consider. And in trying to decide, it's helpful to think about your strengths as the teacher. What are you good at? And that doesn't mean don't grow. It doesn't mean don't only do the things you're already good at. Learn new things. But you should allow your strengths and where you have some joy and some excitement about teaching to guide what you do. But you also want to bear in mind your students. What are they good at? What are they less good at? If I had my way, I'd give every new TA 2 sections of something, 2 different sets of students, to have the experience of believing you're preparing one class, one subject matter, and have to do it completely differently between the 8 a.m. class and the 2 p.m. class. All right? Because what works for one may not work for another group of students. And even if you have taught a course, like I've taught public speaking dozens of times, no 2 times are exactly the same. Even if the subject matter hasn't changed a whole lot for me, the students keep changing, and it requires a different approach. So knowing their needs can be really helpful to you. You need to think about your learning outcomes for your particular lesson, for your particular course, for a unit, if you're in a unit. Okay. And those can shape whether you use discussion or a group activity or whatever it is that you're using. And context. Context can matter too, right? If it's the day before Thanksgiving, right? Or if it's the last class period before the final exam, those kinds of decisions will influence what you do with your students. But clear teachers provide clear standards. They explain how they're going to evaluate something. They're not scared of that. They don't fear a grade challenge because they know that they have done many different things in many different ways to clearly communicate their expectations to their students. It's also possible that as a TA, and if you have a large group of students, you may be a little bit worried about managing your classroom environment. This is, how do you keep folks off their cell phones? How do you keep them from, doing things that are distracting for you as a speaker or for students in the room. And there's some research that suggests that students will learn more if they are engaged in time on task. I'm not 100% sold on that, but I do agree that if you're in class, ideally you're focused on the subject matter and not on something unrelated, right? Your chances of learning that subject matter are greatly improved by engaging with it rather than something else. So how do you create that space? There's research to suggest that relatively untrained teachers tend to rely on less effective strategies for classroom management. They tend to threaten. If you don't do this, I will do that, and it'll have this kind of consequence for you, right? It tends to be face-threatening. Like, oh, you're a bad person because you plagiarized. Okay, well, I mean, as they say, love the sinner, hate the sin, right? I mean, if someone has engaged in academically dishonest conduct, you're not leaving open the possibility for a dialogue with that person if you write them off as a bad person for having engaged in misconduct. Much better to isolate that behavior, right? So what we find, though, is that less experienced teachers tend to focus on their teacher authority, trying to make people do stuff, having consequences for doing stuff, taking cell phones away and doing that kind of thing. And I would encourage you to think very carefully about how you manage a classroom in more subtle, more positive ways that are more inclusive and thoughtful. And you should rely on your faculty mentors and your supervisors for discipline-specific guidance. I encourage you to model good behaviors, right? Don't do the old do as I say, don't do as I do. Actually do the thing you want them to do. Model that. Model the value in that. Collaborate with them. If there's an issue they're struggling with, open it up so that you're all participants in that conversation so that you can all think about how to proceed and how to deal with a particular challenge. Maybe you find out they're all freaked out because they've all got a midterm on the same day. And that's the day something is due for you. Perhaps there's something that can be done to navigate that, but you won't know unless you open it up. And if you insist on following your plan rigidly and take every action a student has as a threat to your authority, you will not create trust, right? I would also suggest that finding trusted people that you can consult with, whether that's your supervisor, whether that's a more experienced TA in your program, whether that's someone in the Center for Faculty Development, those kinds of people can be your best allies because you can just safely process with them, right? Facebook, probably not the best place to process. Especially, I do not encourage adding students to your Facebook. You're probably all too young to care about Facebook. I don't know. It seems like that's an older, more established person kind of thing. Y'all use Facebook? No? A little bit? Okay. So think very carefully about who you have in that space. And there's a recent article in the Chronicle for Higher Ed that suggests that complaining about students is toxic, right? It's harmful to you as an educator. It's harmful to your students. It adversely affects the classroom environment. But you've got to blow off steam, too. Sometimes students are wily. They do things that are obnoxious. You need a place to talk about that. But the place for that is someplace private with people you trust who can help you keep the focus on something positive that can come out of it, right? The best sorts of classroom management strategies, by the way, help people feel good about their participation in that space. Do this because you're going to feel better for having learned it. Do this because there will be value for you beyond this class. And those tend to be the more effective strategies. The last thing I wanted to touch on that I think maybe allows all this to coalesce a little bit is grading. How many of you have responsibility for assigning grades? Oh, yeah. Okay. It would be completely understandable to have a little anxiety about assigning grades because we've been on the receiving end of grades our whole life. And I think grades, we need to do a little work to think about grades as meaningful communication. Grades at their most most fundamental level are about helping students understand what behaviors to keep doing and what behaviors to stop doing for their success in your course, in your discipline, in their career paths as you're aware of them, that kind of thing, right? So you're giving them wise counsel, and it's news they can use. Some of the feedback you provide will be formative. Some of it will be evaluative. But it is also possible to have students come back to you and ask questions about it without it being face-threatening for you or without feeling like you have done something wrong. Okay. Still, I think it might help to know when grade disputes are more likely to occur. And this was compiled by Ron Rogers, the Associate Dean in the College of Social Sciences. And he's observed, and the folks on the Student Fairness Committee have observed, that grade disputes will happen most often when students feel like they're being evaluated by criteria they weren't given, right? So you're applying a standard that you didn't tell them about, where they feel like you're adding requirements after the fact. So you explain what this assignment is like one day, and then a couple weeks later you explain it again, but you add some more stuff to that explanation. They're going to feel like you're adding more things in. When the grades are based on criteria other than the academic performance in the course. And this is something as a department chair I would always check for. You cannot fail all of the Dodgers fans in your class, no matter how much they deserve it, right? And worse are the Anaheim Angels fans. So, but you can't fail them. And all kidding aside, you cannot deploy criteria other than their performance on that particular task. It can't be outside information, right? You need where grading disputes will occur is whenever you're inconsistent. So two students get the same answers right, but one gets an A and one gets a B. That's meaningfully grievable, right? They have a right to question that. This is about showing that you're fair and that you're applying consistent standards from the first thing that you look at all the way out to the last piece of student work you look at. I think that suggests something really important, too, about how you grade, where you grade, under what circumstances you grade. It makes me think of how we tell little kids to set up a workspace that's well lit and clean and orderly and in which you can focus, right? Same kind of thing for grading. You want to set up a pleasurable, comfortable, warm space that's not too distracting. You don't want to have to sit at the punishment chair and do all of your grading in Canvas. That's not going to help anyone's grade or your attitude, right? At some level, you may want to do this the rest of your life. Wouldn't it be nice for the feedback you provide students to be a useful experience? You are learning what they took from what you thought you were teaching, which is super helpful to know. And you get to give them feedback on how to grow and improve. And while we're a little bit worried about a student coming back and challenging a grade sometimes, that's okay. You can talk to them because your standards were fair, they were consistently applied, you didn't invoke other details that you knew about some students but not about others, right? So consistency is key. Other ways in which grade disputes can occur, though, have to do with not responding to them in a timely way. They ask you a question about the assignment and you just go radio silent. They're going to be angry about that. Think about how angry you would be. You need help with something. And, okay, it's one thing if you try to send that message at midnight and the assignment's due the next morning. That's on the student, right? But if they got to you in advance and you don't reply, they have every right to be ticked, just like you would if you try to reach out to your instructor for insight and help in advance of an assignment. Similarly, they will engage in a grade dispute if you issue a grade, but you're unwilling to discuss that grade or how you arrived at that grade. What will they do? They'll advance it to your supervisor, to the instructor of record if you're not that person, or to the department chair if you're the instructor of record. And then if all else fails, they'll go to an associate dean or they'll go to the ombudsman's office. They have some mechanisms they can and should use. And that's good insight for you, right? Your students as well. A grade dispute doesn't have to be a threatening, face-threatening relationship ender. It can be a conversation about how an instructor arrived at a grade. And where you don't understand it, it's completely reasonable to ask for greater clarification. Okay. The last piece, I'm not sure. I think Alex Froelich may have mentioned this morning, our conduct officer. Students may dispute a grade if they believe they'll be removed from a course without due process. And I think it's worth just saying again, you can't tell a student, get out and don't come back, or, you know, don't bother doing this if you didn't complete the assignment, right? That your goal is to always try to keep a reasonable student at the table and keep them learning. It doesn't mean you need to take abuse, but it does mean that you can't just dismiss someone because you don't feel like they have performed effectively on an assignment, for example. Okay. All right, so at this point, I have a couple minutes. If you'd like to ask questions, this would be a good time. I could take one or two. Yes, sir.
What's an effective way to deal with like disruptive students in the class?
Oh, that's a tricky one because it really, as you know, depends a lot on the type of disruption, right? The little kind of innocent disruptions that are kind of annoying, but they're not really disrupting other people around them. It's almost better to catch up with those folks privately, one-on-one. Hey, you know what? It's really distracting to me as an instructor when you're doing this or that. Could we agree that maybe you could just stop, or you could silence your cell phone, or you could, whatever it is, when you come to class next? That's so awesome. And usually at that level of interpersonal relationship, they're not called out, their face isn't threatened in front of their peers. They're often willing to move with you. It's helpful to remember that most disruptions aren't personal, right? It's because people are, you know, they're distractible and they're in their own heads and they're, you know, they're young and it's spring and it's whatever, or whatever's going on with them. It's almost never about you unless you've said something completely hostile or unkind or wrong. And so if you can think of ways to catch up with them interpersonally, more confidentially, that's typically better, I think. Humor can be a real asset to you as long as it's good-natured, kind-spirited humor. Like, you know, I've said to students, look, I know that doodling helps you focus. I totally get it. And the drawings are fantastic. When you sit up here and I'm looking at the drawings, now I'm all absorbed in your drawings. I just can't even focus. I'm too absorbed in this MC Escher stuff that you're doing right here in the front. And usually it's like, haha, it's light, you know, and they're not mad at me. And they're like, oh, okay, I'll be more subtle. Or, you know, what if I sat over here? Oh, well, that'd be cool. And you can almost always come to some kind of agreement. You should always trust your gut, though. If you ever have a disruption that's really concerning to you, obviously you would want to let students go, work it out with a supervisor, and figure out how to come back to them. But the little stuff is usually, you know, hey, maybe we could leave this row open for late arrivers, or you can even turn that out to students and say, I understand you're adults. I need you to come in and be fully focused. If you arrive late, which you shouldn't do often, but if you do, I can't have you cut in front of people. Can we agree to leave this row open, or what shall we do for folks who arrive late? But often you can make those conversations where you get some buy-in. That's what I'd recommend. Okay, well, I don't want to keep you really any longer than we've said we would. I've put the center information up there. I'm going to hand out a flyer that has my contact information on it again. You'll have access to these slides. And if there's anything you want to follow up with me about, I'm very happy to talk to you. If I don't know the answer, I'll put you in touch with the person who does. Okay? Thank you so much. Have a great first semester, or I assume first semester in some cases.
Thank you, Deanna. All right, wonderful. While you pass those out, I'll just make a couple of final remarks. I think that you have received an awful lot of information today, and there's absolutely no way that you will remember even 30% of it. I'm sure you don't remember the details about which exceptions to FERPA exist, for example, things like that. So what really is the important point here is to know that there are these categories of things that you need to be thinking about. What is Title IX? What is FERPA? You know, what does it mean to have a student with a disability in the classroom? And then to have a resource where you can go and get the information in detail. You now have a lay of the land, and you can go and ask for help. We have an incredibly rich campus in terms of support structures, not only for students, but also for TAs and for faculty and for administrators. So please make use of those resources. Finally, I just want to say, welcome to a wonderful adventure that is being a teacher, and I wish you all the greatest success. Finally, you will be receiving some kind of a survey from us just to let us know what you thought about the way this was structured. As I said, this is sort of new for us, so please fill in the information, give us your comments, both positive and negative, and that will help to make it a better experience for students in coming years. So thank you so much for coming, and best of luck.